And as a result, what happens? God gets the glory, and others respond and say, we have seen remarkable things today. Have you ever noticed what makes a person or a company unique and sets them apart from everyone else? What sets a sports team or a sports figure or an entertainer or a business person or an entrepreneur apart from the rest? What are those features and characteristics that make them a cut above the rest, distinct and unique? Have we ever seen that? What makes someone that's unique and special? As someone in their field of business that sets them apart from everyone else. What makes them different in a good way? What makes them the best at what they are? What makes them different from everyone else in that? Think about that in your own mind. You never notice different people, like an entertainer who could dance better than anyone else, or a singer who could sing better than anyone else, or a business person who had an innovative idea that set them apart, like Bill Gates did, that set them apart from everyone else.
Or Bryce Harper.
Or Bryce Harper from the Phillies, that set them apart from everyone else. And think about that, because we all know that, and we all see that, and we all know people and companies and businesses and organizations that set them apart. Today in the past, Jesus sets himself apart in his ministry as he healed. He spent time with his Father, and he heals one who comes to him in faith. So we see here, as we're going to look at this morning, that Jesus sets himself apart from everyone else and all his peers and everyone else during his lifetime and during his ministry. And that's what's going to make the difference here. And what sets what sets him apart? And we're going to look at those things. There's three things. 3 points. Listening, cleansing. He cleanses. Praying. And forgiveness and healing. So we see here that Jesus is going to do some things that are uniquely special. And it's not only they're uniquely special, but that they're the things that set him apart from everyone else. Well, let's go on here. Let's look at this. Our first point, we're going to be looking at the Gospel of Luke chapter 5, verses 12 through 26. Let's read that together. While he was in one of the cities, behold, there was a man covered with leprosy, and when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and implored him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And he stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately the leprosy left him. And he ordered him to tell no one, but to go and show himself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing, just as Moses commanded, as a testimony to them. But the news about him was spreading even farther, and large crowds were gathering to hear him and to be healed of their sickness. But Jesus would often slip away to the wilderness and pray. One day he was teaching, and there were some Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting there, who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was present for him to perform healing. And some of the men were carrying on a bed a man who was paralyzed, and they were trying to bring him in and to set him down in front of him. But not finding any way to bring him because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and let him down through the tiles with his stretcher, and into the middle of the crowd in front of Jesus. Seeing their faith, he said, Friend, your sins are forgiven you. The scribes and the Pharisees began to reason, saying, Who is this man who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? But Jesus, aware of their reasoning, answered and said to them, Why are you reasoning in your hearts? What is easier to say, your sins have been forgiven you, or to say, get up and walk? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority either to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I say to you, get up and pick up your stretcher and go home. Immediately he got up before them and picked up what lying on and went home glorifying God. They were all struck with astonishment and began glorifying God as they were filled with fear, saying, "We have seen remarkable things today." And may God add the blessing to the reading of His Word. Cleansing. One of the things that set Jesus apart from in His ministry was, as we look here, that a person was cleansed here. But it was how the person was cleansed here. And one of the distinctive features that set Jesus apart was His compassion for people. Compassion for people. If you look at Jesus, He always had that compassion for people. He felt in His heart, He felt in His spirit a love and a mercy for people. So often we were talking in Sunday school today. I don't know how we got on the subject. We were talking about real estate, and they were saying how sometimes real estate can be cutthroat, and that people just really don't care. And part of it is that people were out to obviously get things for themselves. But one of the things about Jesus is that He was always compassionate towards people. And when you're cutthroat or you don't care about people, you don't care about things, you care about yourself. And Jesus, not that He didn't care about Himself, He cared about Himself, but He cared about others as well in a compassionate way. Now, look at the scene here. Jesus is, He was in one of the cities, and there was a man covered with leprosy. Now, I'm sure we've heard this story many times, but the reality was, back in those days, leprosy, it was described as a skin disease that was very debilitating, where eventually they had no treatment for it. And eventually what would happen is your skin would fall off, and limbs would literally, digits would fall off, hands would fall off, you would break down because of the disease and the magnitude of the disease. And the disease itself was very contagious. So you couldn't, and as was prescribed by the law, if you look in the Jewish law in Leviticus, was that the person had a skin disease, they would have to put themselves out from the rest of the crowd according to the law, and they would have to live outside of the community. And whenever they approached the community, or they approached anyone or any person that was clean, that didn't have a disease, they would have to shout out, "Unclean, unclean, unclean." And so therefore they were ostracized. They felt like they were ostracized and apart from everyone else. How would we feel if we had to shout unclean and we couldn't be around people? God created us to be social beings. He created us to be around people. He created us to have that sense of community and be with others. He did. That's how He created us. Not separate in our own cloistered world. And the reality is that these people had to live in their own cloistered world because that's what the law prescribed, because they were sick. It wasn't anything of their own fault or anything that they could have done to prevent it. There was no medical treatment for it at that time. So they had to live. Could you imagine having to live that type of lifestyle? Knowing that your body's breaking down and knowing that you couldn't have any contact with other people. Well, Jesus knew all that. Jesus was aware of that. You think that affected Jesus? Do you think that fazed Jesus to say, "Oh, I better not go near him. Here comes a leper. I better not go near him." Even though what Jesus came for, He came for people, right? Well, I better not go near him. I don't want to get a chance that I'm going to get sick. I better not touch him. I better not. Think about it. He had that option because he was human. He could have got sick, right? Could have. He could have had the option saying, "No, I better not because I don't want to get sick. I don't want to." But he felt what? He felt compassion. And what did he do? He reached out and he touched the man, didn't he? Even though he could have gotten sick, right? Because why? What motivated him to touch the man? Was it just because of duty? Well, duty wouldn't touch somebody who was, if you were going to get contagious, even no matter how dutiful you were, no matter how much of a commitment you were to do what you were supposed to do, if you had a chance of getting sick, you wouldn't do it. Right? You wouldn't just do it out of duty. Well, the reality was that Jesus wasn't motivated by duty. He was motivated by what? Compassion and love. How the song said, how Jesus loves me. He was motivated out of love and compassion for his people. That's what set him apart. That's what set him apart from everyone else. Is the ministry that he had in his heart for people. I work with people all the time. Not only here in the church here, but I'm a social worker. I've been a social worker my whole life. I work with kids and their families in some really difficult and challenging situations. And it causes me, by God's grace, to be able to have compassion for some of these, for these families and for these children and the situations and the circumstances that they're in. I wouldn't be able to do what I do unless God had supernaturally given me the compassion in my heart and the love in my heart for the clients that I work with. Some of them, I can't share the gospel because they're secular organizations. I can't do that, but I can still show them the love and the compassion of Jesus, which even speaks louder sometimes. Right? Same thing with us. The reality is that we have to ask ourselves the question, what sets us apart from everyone else? What sets us apart from our neighbor or from our family member? Not that you're looking, that you're haughty or that, oh, I'm better than them. I'm not saying that. But what sets you apart as a person, as an individual, as a Christian from everyone else? And one of those characteristics, like Jesus, should be the compassion and the love that you have for people. People know when you care. People know when you love them or are genuinely concerned about them or genuinely care about them. Are we perfect? No. Am I perfect? Absolutely not. But we should strive to have that, by God's grace, that compassion and that love for people. Because that's what will set us apart. That's what people will see. That's what people will remember. Won't they? He was a kind person. She was a kind person. He was a loving person. Even though you may have not said a word, they remember that compassion. People remember kindness, don't they? Because sometimes in our world, they can be very rare, right? Back in this day, it was kind of rare as well. And it says here, he stretched out he says, and willing, he fell on his face and implored him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now look at what this man had here. The man here says, Lord, if you're willing. He had faith, and he looked, and he said he was imploring what? In Jesus' compassion, wasn't he? He was pleading Jesus' compassion, that Jesus would be compassionate. And what did Jesus say? Yeah. And Jesus said, I am willing to be cleansed, and immediately the leprosy left him. Jesus had the power and the authority, but it all started with a heart of compassion. And listen to what Jesus tells him. In order to tell no one, but to go yourself and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for cleansing, just as Moses commanded as a testimony to them. And even within that, Jesus was staying within the law. And what was Jesus' purpose there? Jesus' purpose was not only to be a testimony to this man, but to be a testimony to others as well. So, and also this was in the law, if you were sick and you got well, you had to go bring an offering to the priests who were ministering in the temple. And you were to go there and you were to make that offering. And so Jesus, as a testimony to them, so Jesus was telling them, go to the temple, go to the priest, and make the offering as a testimony for them, so they can see too. So it's a sort of a validation of the work that Jesus has done, so others can see. Because the leaders are the ones that need to see that. They need to see that Jesus is real, right? Don't they? And so the reality is that this validates that the work that Jesus does And the work that Jesus is doing is real. And it's a validation to whom? To the leaders and to everyone else. That Jesus genuinely heals and does and shows compassion and love towards others. But the news about him spread even further, and larger crowds were gathering to hear him, and so to be healed of their sicknesses. So the news about Jesus was spreading. Even though Jesus asked him to go to the temple, the news would continue to spread about Jesus. People want to get healed. People want to hear about life. People want those things, and that news was hard to not be spread all around. So Jesus' popularity is growing here, isn't it? Now think about this. If you look at entertainers today, how many entertainers would tell someone, and they do well, and they're a good, let's say a singer. Well, don't tell anybody that I sing well. Don't tell anybody that I'm doing this, because I don't want my popularity to grow. You think they would do that? That's ludicrous. They wouldn't do that. Of course, they would say, tell everyone and anyone you can. But Jesus was saying, no, you don't need to. But you know what? God takes care of the people that he wants to bring to us, doesn't he? You don't need to brag about yourself. You don't need to brag about, look at me, look what I've done. One of the things I'm memorizing the book of the chapter of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and trying to memorize that as one of my chapters. And one of the things, the last one I remember was, I think, verse 4. It says love does not boast and is not arrogant. And I thought about that. Love doesn't need to be able to boast about who you are and what you do. Because it's not about you. Love doesn't always have to say, look what I've done. And look at me, I'm better than you, in that arrogance way. What I've accomplished. And that's the way Jesus was, and that's what set him apart. That's what made that love, that's what made that compassion and that love such a blessing. Because he didn't need to tell others. Because that people would come anyway. So the reality is that we need to know that everything that we have, everything that we are, is what because of him. And he showed us mercy, and he showed us compassion, and he showed us love, didn't he? And we therefore need to do that with others. Okay, let's go on here. Let's go on to our second point. So we see cleansing here. Forgiveness and healing. A distinctive feature of Jesus' ministry here is reliance on God the Father and a determination to do as well. My second point is praying. Distinctive feature of this is Jesus' ministry is prayer. But Jesus himself would often slip away into the wilderness and pray. Think about that in verse 16. What did Jesus do? But Jesus himself would, how many times? Once in a while? Would often do what? He would often slip away and find himself in the wilderness and praying. Here were all these people coming. We just talked about all these people coming and looking for him. And you're thinking, wow, this is great. I love having all these people come to me and to being dependent upon me and relying upon me. But Jesus knew that he needed alone time with the Father, didn't he? Because here he was human, but he was still God, but at the same time, in his humanity, he knew he needed time alone with his Father to get recharged, to get reinvigorated, to get refocused, to get the strength that he needed in order to do what he needed to do. So not only was he compassionate, but set him apart as compassion and love, but also what set him apart is that he took the time to be alone with the Father. That's what makes a person strong. That's what makes a person find their strength. Because where does strength come from? Neither might nor power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. So the reality is that we're not strong because of who we are as a person. We're strong because of Him. And that strength comes from, that wisdom comes from, that love comes from, that compassion comes from our time with Him. Being in His presence. Being with Him. Getting refreshed. Getting your batteries recharged. How often do we have to get our batteries recharged? All the time. And so often Jesus would do that. Even Jesus, right? If Jesus did, so what? Shouldn't we? Right? Absolutely. We should too. And so that's what made Jesus set apart, because how many of the other religious leaders at that time would do that? They would do it out of duty, right? Well, I need to go and pray. I need to go and do my duty in prayer. And we often look at it that way, don't we? Rather than do it because you love the Father. And you know, and you need to be dependent upon Him for that. You find your strength, God, I need you today. I find myself all the time, folks. All the time. I need to. I can't do it. I need wisdom. I need understanding. I need strength. And the older I get, the more strength I find I need. I do. And the reality is that we're all there. But what will set us apart is us taking the time to do it. Maybe putting down our cell phones. Maybe putting the TV down for a minute. Maybe putting the book down for a minute. Or our busyness, because I can get busy. I sometimes overly do it. Okay, I always have to be doing something. And rather than just saying, being Martha, maybe you know Mary and Martha, where Martha was always busy doing something, and Jesus says, you're worried and busy about so many things, but only one thing is necessary. And your sister Mary has chosen the better. And what was Mary doing? She was sitting at the feet of Jesus. I'm not saying you just sit idly and don't do anything. What I'm saying is that you take the time from our busyness and you take time to be with Jesus. Because time with Jesus is more valuable than getting things done. Because you'll be amazed at what happens when you take the time to be with Jesus, how many things get done. Because you took the time to be with Him. How He supernaturally gets those things done and takes care of those things. Because we took the time to be with Him. But that's what sets our ministry, that's what sets us apart. And that's what set Jesus apart. And lastly, as I was saying before, our last point is forgiveness and healing. A distinctive feature of Jesus' ministry is reliance on God the Father and a determination to do His will. I often looked at people who are like these big football players that are big and strong and muscles. And there was one guy that was on the Eagles that was 350 pounds plus pounds, 6'8", and had muscles bulging from everywhere. He's a pretty strong, physically strong person. And you would think that that person, from a physical standpoint, wouldn't need to rely on anyone else. Right? Or you think of a person that's brilliant, that has intellectual abilities that are off the charts. And you think, well, they don't really need anybody, right? They don't need to really rely on people. And we look at those things like intellect and physical strength as benchmarks of how capable a person is. We do. What's their skill sets? How skilled and capable are they? And then that's their reliance, that's their strength. But you look at, and Jesus, if you look at Jesus, He was probably the most brilliant person in the world. But think about it. He was the he was the one who created the world. Think about it. He wasn't the strongest physically. But Jesus always took time to rely on whom? On the Father. Where's our reliance? Who do we rely on? Who do we depend on? Who do we look to for our strength? Reliance upon the Father. Let's go look at this. And his obedience and the determination. How many of us are determined? When we're bound and determined to do something, so we dig our heels in. We dig our heels in the dirt, so to speak, and we're bound and determined to do something. How many of us do that? I know I get that way sometimes. Is it for the right reasons, though? Is it for the right thing? Is it for the gospel? Are we bound and determined to do God's will? And that's what Jesus was, and that's what set him apart. His reliance on God the Father and determination to do his will. He was teaching, and some Pharisees and teachers of the law, verse 17, were sitting there, who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea, from Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was present for him to perform healing. So what was present for him? Power from the Lord. Where did the power come from? Came from the Lord. So what was Jesus relying on? His own power? Or power from the Lord? So there's a reliance there. You see the reliance on God and his power and his strength? That's what we have to do. Reliance upon his power and his strength. Again, not by might nor by power, but what? By my Spirit, saith the Lord. And some were carrying a man who was paralyzed. They were trying to bring him and set him down in front of him. Now, look at this. If you go down here further, and this same story is in Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. But what were they doing? Here they were, Jesus was in somebody's house, and there was a big crowd there. Here's a man on a stretcher, and here were his friends. And they were carrying this man here and saying, we got to get to Jesus. We got to get to Jesus. We have to get to Jesus. And think about that. They figured things out to the point where, well, we're willing to go on top of his house, get this man up there, and they had to dig a hole in the roof. There was thatch roof, thatch and mud and some other things, but they made a way where they were able to get a hole in the roof and get this man lowered down in front of Jesus. And it took a lot of work, but they were determined what? To get him to Jesus. And the reality is that determination was able to get this man healed. The man couldn't get himself to Jesus, but his friends were able to get him to Jesus because they believed that God could bring that healing. And so the reality was, sometimes it takes a little work, doesn't it? To see God's will get done. But when we're able to do it and we're determined to see God's will get done, what happens? Great things happen when we're determined to do God's will. It was God's will for this man to be healed, wasn't it? And so his friends were helping him, and his friends were assisting him to make sure that he got into a place where his man could be healed. And it goes on here. It says, seeing whose faith? His faith or whose faith? Their faith. It's plural. Their faith. So he saw the faith of his friends that were willing to bring this man to him to believe. Maybe this man didn't have enough faith. Maybe the man was struggling. How would you feel, being a paralytic for a long time and not being able to walk, and you're kind of struggling in your faith? Or you're sick and you're trying to struggle in your faith. Don't you need friends around you to help bolster you? Don't you need a brother or a sister there to help pull you up and to help bolster you in your faith? Hey, come on, we can do this. Let's look to the Lord. Let's trust the Lord. Let's trust Him. Let's believe Him. And then you help that person in their faith do what they need to do in order to get that person to Jesus so they can be healed and made whole. Let's say, again, I'll give an example. What happens if you, how many of us know people, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, know people that are struggling emotionally or mentally? And they're really struggling. Or even just physically, or even just spiritually, they're struggling. Or they're struggling in some other form or fashion. And we see them, and we know that. How many of us come alongside your faith, and you're doing good in your faith? And how many of us come alongside and say, "Come on, let's helping that person and get that person to Jesus, and helping them to get that person there, so that they can find healing, and they can find renewed life." I remember working at. I worked in rescue missions for a long, long time, for 25 plus years. In Philly, in Newark, in Atlantic City. And one of the things I saw often, many times, I would have to monitor chapel services. They would have chapel services every night, and different church groups would come in, and they would monitor the services. And one of the things is that sometimes guys and individuals would be really in deep sin. A lot of them had been struggling with addictions, whether it be alcohol or drugs, or just they just had a really bad time. And there would be people there, like in the church group, that would take them and bring them, and they would have altar calls, and people would come, and their lives would be forever changed. I saw that. I witnessed that. That people would take the time, friends would take the time, for someone they couldn't have done that, and they come alongside of them, and they bring them, and a person encounters Jesus, and they're healed. And they come and have a relationship with Jesus. And sometimes it takes a little effort on our part, but they're bound and determined to help others see Jesus. And believe that what Jesus can do can change your life, and Jesus can make a difference. And that's really important to have. That's what can set people apart, that they're bound and determined for the right reasons. Does that make sense? Bound and determined to do things for the right reason out of faith. And what did Jesus say to him? "Friend, your sins are forgiven you." But Jesus, aware of the reasoning, answered and said to them, "Why are you reasoning in your hearts? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven you,' or to say, 'Get up and walk'? But so you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He said to the paralytic, "I say to you, get up, pick up your stretcher, and go home." When Jesus does something, He does it to show compassion, but also He does it to do what? As a testimony to the person, but also to the person and the influence around them. And to those who can see it, as a testimony to them, to show them, yes, I am real. This is who I am. And it's not so that we can get people to look at us and say, "Wow, look at," let's say you brought a friend to the Lord, you helped lead a person to the Lord, and then you look at yourself and say, "Wow, I did a great job. I brought Brother Bob or Sister Lucy to the Lord." And you take the credit for it, rather than giving the credit to God and saying, "Look what God has done," and others see it, and others come to the Lord as well. So you see that? And see, there's a big difference. So that Jesus can get the glory, and so others can come, and others can be healed in our lives. And that needs to be our mindset. That's what should set us apart. Not that we can get the glory, not so that we can brag, and not so we can be arrogant. But like I said before, that love factor, where the love says, yeah, I don't need the glory for myself. I don't need to be praised. I don't need people to look at me. I don't need the people see what great ministry I have and what great things I'm doing. I need to be pointed back to God so that others can come to God. Not come to a man. Because a man is going to come and they're going to go and they're going to return to the dust. They'll go and be in heaven with Jesus, but they'll return to the dust. But if you point him to God, he's eternal and he's not going away. And that's what we need to do. We can't take any glory for ourselves. We'll fail. We're human. The best preacher, the best minister, the best pastor, the best worship leader, the best Bible teacher in the world is human. And that hymn writer that wrote Victory in Jesus was only 54 years old when he passed. He suffered a stroke at 52. I learned that was all new to me. But the reality was, and he was a very prolific songwriter in the South. He wrote many hymns. He wrote hundreds of hymns and hundreds of songs. But the reality was, he passed away at a young age, relatively speaking. He was just a man. But who gave him the inspiration to write those wonderful hymns and that wonderful song? I remember singing those hymns, that song. That was a popular song in the rescue mission during those gospel services. We used to sing that all the time. But who did the victory come from? Victory came from Jesus. Victory came from Jesus. It goes back to him. And that's why we give our testimony. It's not me. You never heard Billy Graham say, I did a great job today. And even though hundreds of thousands of people during the course of his lifetime came to know the Lord, maybe millions, could have been. No one knows the exact number, but except God alone. But the reality is that Billy Graham could have easily had said, that was me. Look at the great work. I had George Beverly O'Shea, one of the best song leaders out there, for years. He could have said that, but he didn't. The reality was he knew it was all God. And that's the way we need to do it as well. Well, let's finish up here. And verse 25, immediately he got up before him, picked up what he was lying on, and went home glorifying God. And what was the result of that? What was the result of all that? They were all struck with astonishment and began glorifying God. Again, when Jesus pointed back to the Father, when he looked to the Father, what happened? Everyone began glorifying God, and they were filled with fear, saying, we have seen remarkable things. What sets apart a person from everyone else is their compassion and their love. We see that they know where to go when they need recharging, they need prayer, and they need time alone with the Father. And then lastly, they know that they're relying on God the Father to do the work. They're relying on God to do the work, and they're determined to do his will. And as a result, what happens? God gets the glory, and others respond and say, we have seen remarkable things today. You want others to say, we have seen remarkable things today, not about you, but about God. You want that? You watch what God does in your life as you put him first. And your ministry and the work that God has called you to do, whatever that is, whatever shape or fashion that comes in, your work will be set apart from everyone else. As one ministry that's of the Lord. And all of us are called to some type of ministry, whether it's to our neighbor, or to our family member, to anyone. It doesn't have to be in a church. Ministry does not have to be in a church. It can be anywhere, folks. Amen?